working with founders, there's a couple of key things that I look for. And to be honest, sometimes you find them and sometimes you don't, and you have to adapt. But I would say for me, founders and leadership in general, I think one of the really important qualities for me is humility. I think having the humility as a founder to know what you don't know, to ask for help, to do what you do excellently and recognize what you don't, and leading company from a position of humility, I think is really important.
Maybe one, you sort of mentioned like luck, right? For your career. A lot of it's been luck, but I would push back and say, I think people create their own luck to some extent. And so
Yeah.
what was your luck? I mean, even getting mentored by the head of the New York McKinsey office, right? Like, there were lots of new people at McKinsey at the time, I'm sure. Why did he take an interest in you? Like, what did you do to stand out? What is your advice to other young people getting started?
If they talk to you about something they're passionate about or they did, it might not have been in their, sort of job description, if that makes sense. Like, I remember working at McKinsey and I was on this cool healthcare project that I had just volunteered as a part of this team to be a part of. It had nothing to do with my job, but I thought, wow, this is really cool. I want to learn more about this.
But you have Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all these other companies, Apple, right, who have these kind of hard charging cultures that are sort of well known for really pushing. Tesla, of course, another great example, in SpaceX, right, where they have founders who are pushing the boundaries in every single way. They're not known for being warm and fuzzy, but man, they probably are well known for making all their employees really rich. Welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast. It is great to have Anna Lenhardt here with me today. In a lot of this is why it's so great to have her here is because I get to learn about what it means to build a fantastic culture team from the HR perspective, because that's one of, I think, the hardest positions to fill, hardest to find the right people, and the incredible importance of building a fantastic team is so critical to a startup success that having an expert like Annie here with me will hopefully teach me and everyone else who's listening what entrepreneurial excellence means from the HR perspective. And before I go deep and let Anna tell a little bit more about herself, I should let everyone know that Anna was the VP of people at Oscar Health, which went from 250 to over 1,000 people pre-IPO, the head of people at Hippo Insurance, which was scaled massively from 100 to 600 people, chief of people at Tomorrow Health. She's an advisor right now at Budgie Health, and she is also the founder and principal at Lenhardt Partners, which is HR consulting for startups. So she is a true expert about what it means to build HR, do HR, build a great team, which once again is this foundational element to startups. So Anna, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you and looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I like to do on these shows, first, maybe like walk me through when you think through all these amazing founders you've worked with and you've learned from, and you made proactive decisions for your own career as an individual. I mean, I think actually sometimes I think people forget that HR people have their own career they're trying to build. Like when you're making your own proactive decisions for your career and you're thinking, what companies do I want to go to that are going to give me the things that I'm looking for? What are the elements you look for in the founders that you think have led them to success for some of these companies that you've worked at?
Yeah. So I think for me, working with founders, there's a couple of key things that I look for. And, to be honest, sometimes you find them and sometimes you don't, and you have to adapt. But I would say for me, founders and leadership in general, I think one of the really important qualities for me is humility. I think having the humility as a founder to know what you don't know, to ask for help, to do what you do excellently and recognize what you don't, and leading company from a position of humility, I think is really important. I think the second piece is
sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Really quick question on that front. I'm a job seeker. How do I figure out that the company has a leader who understands humility and acts that way? Like, how do I even figure that out?
I think you would ask the people that you're interviewing with very much about that question. Like how does the CEO or founder handle disappointing news or a loss? Like how honest are they with how the company is doing, if things are going well, if things are not going well? Do they acknowledge and own their own mistakes as a leader? or are they constantly kind of upselling the next thing rather than taking a moment to reflect? I think you can see those behaviors within also how the people that are at the company as well too. Like what values do they have? Is it always jostling? Are people always trying to, look for a different position, or is there a lot of politicking going on? That's, usually representative of a leader who may not have those qualities of humility or vulnerability. And it's more about getting in front of them than actually maybe either doing the work or having the humility to know what work you can do and what you can't. And I think this is really tough for founders, especially when you're starting your own company, especially when you're raising money and you're selling a big vision, right, to the rest of the organization. But the best leaders that I have been mentored by and learned from, and I think have been the most successful, are the ones that are kind of in the bullpen with the analysts, asking questions and acknowledging and owning their own mistakes. That's incredibly hard to do, but I think it builds a really wonderful culture.
Are there any heuristics people look for? Like, do you find people who are better at asking questions, are they later in their career, a little bit more mature, or is it just something that some people are good at and some people are bad at? Can you train yourself to be that way? Like, have you seen founders who've made a conscious journey to get better at that? Or is it just you're kind of born with it?
Yeah, I think there are some that are born with that sort of sense of value system. Just they were grown up that way, they were mentored that way to be humble. And I think there are others that, have to learn the hard way, and they've gotten feedback from whether it's other founders, board members, coaches, people they trust, and they've actively worked on, okay, how can I communicate or change my style to where I'm still confident, but I can still lead as a leader from that place of humanity to where I can really build and scale an amazing culture. I think once you do that, people work harder for you. They are bought into the mission and vision. The company becomes more successful. It really seems like such a small, maybe element to focus on, but that I think humility really shows up when you take a company to the New York Stock Exchange and the stock price stays high because leadership's not leaving, the board is invested, you have a great product because there is that humility to keep learning and growing.
Yep. No, that makes a ton of sense. So I know I cut you off. What are the other elements that you view as entrepreneurial excellence?
So I think that kind of along with that, I think the ability as a founder to hire great talent around you, to really clearly understand what you do well and what you don't do well, right? And not try to do everything. I think I've met quite a few founders who sort of want to keep their fingers in all the pies and do everything because they don't want to let go. It's hard to let go of that control. But I think if you can reflect on, okay, what it is that I'm extraordinary at, like what is my superpower as a founder? Am I great raising money in investor relations? Am I a great people manager? Am I a great leader? Really being honest with yourself to know, okay, I need to hire the yin to my yang, whatever that looks like for you, I think is really important. And knowing as a founder, it's okay not to know everything. It's okay to make mistakes, and to be able to hire great people around you to support you. It really does become about your leadership team and less about you as a founder, or it should very quickly for you to be able to successfully build and scale a company.
And so how do you, I guess two things there. How did the best founders identify their weaknesses? Like, do they get an executive coach? Do they just over time start to recognize I'm not great at these things? How do they identify those elements? And then sort of number two that I would love to get into is how do you find those right people? So it's sort of a recruiting question, but how do you find the right people to fill those gaps?
So I think to your first question, I think you definitely get the feedback. I mean, every founder started as an analyst somewhere, right? Or an associate somewhere, and they received feedback about what are the things that they're really strong at, what are they not. You can also sort through that feedback work process. You also, you have friends, you have connections with people that you can ask and say, hey, what am I really good at? And what am I not? What am I not great at? Right. And I think just being open to what that feedback is. And then as you start thinking about this amazing, incredible vision you have and this company you have, start thinking about, okay, if I really truly want to hit these milestones and vision, like how do I make sure that I'm disseminating this passion and vision for the company, but that I'm bringing in other people to do that. So I think it's a combination of number one, for sure, like feedback throughout your career from both personal and professional perspectives, friends and family. There's tons of, you can take there's a ton of personality tests and things like that. If you're just curious about learning more about yourself, there's that too. And then number three, I think coaching is great, whether it's your therapist or your
Yep.
coach, someone that can give you that really unadulterated, clear feedback about what they see about you. And I think we're all human, right? We're all figuring things out. We should all be curious and thinking about how can I improve myself and this extraordinary company I'm building. So I think it's a combination of a bunch of different factors. And I think the openness to ask those questions and be the willingness to change behaviors or adopt, I think is a really important quality in a CEO and founder.
And when you go back to thinking through once in your career and those elements, were you proactively going after these companies that you worked at, or did you probably, because you were building out a great, your own name for yourself, they probably came after you? How did that work? But even when someone's recruiting you as an individual, what sort of level of diligence are you doing on these companies and trying to figure out, do I want to go work there?
Yeah, so I come from a very unconventional background. I mean, I came to New York City as an opera singer. I knew nothing about human
Are we going to get you
resources.
to sing on this on?
No.
Gosh.
Only for my
Okay.
kids.
Yeah, fair, fair.
So I came, to New York City as an opera singer, and I took a part-time job at McKinsey and Company. And I was incredibly curious about business, and I was incredibly curious about this brand new area that I knew nothing about. And so I just talked to people and I asked questions, and I had an incredible mentor, Ron Daniel, who passed away recently, who had all of these incredible leadership qualities. He was kind, he took time. He was, the CEO of McKinsey at the New York office at the time. And I was, a scrappy little like associate coming through the door. And I'll never forget that kindness. And so for me, when I think about companies, I think about leaders that I want to work with. I very much think about the people in my life that I found have those qualities, that vulnerability, humility, the ability to sort of see talent in someone. Like today, if he saw, oh my gosh, you're a founder and, principal of your own company from a part-time opera singer working at McKinsey. I mean, that's incredible, right? But he saw that in me when I was in my 20s. And I think that being able to see that kind of potential and cultivate that is another really incredible, I think, quality as a founder and CEO. And so as I took on my career, I mean, I think like most people, I just sort of kind of tried to figure it out. I talked to great people. I tried to find mentors that could teach me about the business. I tried to emulate humility and kindness with others because I was very much always learning and I was always deeply curious. And I got involved in startups, very quickly in New York. And I was really looking at, what's transformational from women's health, and sort of got involved in healthcare. That's my father is a medical director and works for a number of clinics in New
Oh, wow.
Mexico. And so I've always had this kind of very servant led mentality, leadership model, watching him work with in his clinics. And so that sort of drove my passion for healthcare. And so every time I see a company or a startup in the healthcare insurance space, I always thought, oh, that's so interesting. Can we make people's lives better? And for me, that felt very connected to my upbringing and also very connected to sort of these amazing and incredible leaders that I'd had the fortune of just, number one, just asking questions, seeing if they could spend time with me, like not being afraid really of starting those conversations. And so to your question really about how did I find these great companies, I think number one, it's a combination of a bit of luck, right? It's being curious about what you don't know. And I think it's being humble about learning. I mean, I'd worked at a couple of different companies before going to Deloitte in their consulting practice. And I really didn't have a deep understanding of HR. And I thought, you know what? I was a VP director level. I'm going to go back and be a senior consultant. So that was pretty humbling, like not a lot, not as much money, not as much, prestige or position of power at all. Like I was really learning. And I think for me in my career, that constant thirst for knowledge and information and finding great people that shared my same value system has become a really important, I think, element in my career. And, as I'm getting older and as I've done the work more, really refining that to understand that's okay. It's okay to have that sense of values that you aspire to and you hold, and really looking for companies and people that have that same value system. And I think that's is really hard to do when you're younger because you're just starting out your career, you're just putting in long hours, you're trying to figure all of this out. But I think the more and more I go through my career and the more people I meet, I realize that's okay. Like to have a set of values and ethics and integrity that I hold and that I coach and work with other clients around to build companies that also reflect those values, I think is really important.
So many questions from all that. Do you think, I mean, maybe one, you sort of mentioned like luck, right? For your career. A lot of it's been luck, but I would push back and say, I think people create their own luck to some extent. And so
Yeah.
what was your luck? I mean, even getting mentored by the head of the New York McKinsey office, right? Like why did there were lots of new people at McKinsey at the time, I'm sure. Why did he take an interest in you? Like what did you do to stand out? What is your advice to other young people getting started where they can stand out and should they then find a mentor? What does that look like on that sort of how do you build your own luck basically? Because I think a lot of people today, maybe every generation older always thinks like they're just not working hard enough, they're not curious or whatever. But like what is the advice you tell to younger people when they're like, hey, like go be smart about your career, but you have to create your own luck too. It's not just gonna knock on your door, most likely. Or maybe it's it.
You have to be bold, Adam. You have to be bold. And I think, sometimes the women, people of color or those that come from underrepresented backgrounds, I think a lot of times there's been adversity in their life that has kept them from having a voice. And so I think it's really important to be bold and share your voice and your experience and who you are and to ask questions and put it out there, right? Like if I had gone to Ron and, not asked to meet with him and just ask him questions, like he never would have met with me, right? Like, but I asked and I met his EA and I was very nice and I was persistent, and I think to your point about making your own luck, I think if you're given that opportunity, take it. Like the worst they can say is no, right? And find the people that you're like, wow, I really respect them. They built a great company. They have these great qualities. I'd love to learn from them. I think most people that are in a position like that would love to mentor. They love to share their experiences and they want to help support. At least the wonderful leaders that I know and that I respect, they always carve time for that, like myself included. And I think that, doing that and having that skill is something to learn, but it's also to your point about people coming into the business, like just ask.
Yeah.
Just ask, and come with questions and come with what you want to get out of it, right? Really have a plan of the things that you want to learn and where you want to go. And, that's okay. And I remember I applied to Harvard and Ron called me and told me, he's like, hey, I just want you to know you didn't get in. And, of course I was disappointed, but if I hadn't, gone for it, I never would have known. If I had met Ron, I never would have tried, right? So I think you just have to put yourself out there and see what opens up in your life. And it really is amazing and what that, making your luck and being in that position, but doing what you can with that can really open up in your career.
I totally, it's shocking to me that how many people I think don't take that step to just ask those questions and say, hey, like, I want to get this help or advice or thoughts. And they just don't reach out. I've even people make me like, well, I don't want to reach out because Adam, you're so busy. I'm like, no. Like the most important thing I can do is help you unblock you and get you done. Like I will cancel things
Right.
to make sure my team is more successful. And yet they're scared to
Absolutely.
ask. And it's just shocking me that more people don't push on that front.
Yeah,
So
I agree. I think that sense of safety and that voice and feeling like maybe they haven't had someone who's given them that opportunity before. But I totally agree with you, Adam. I think be bold, be brave, ask the questions, grab those opportunities when they come in front of you, and be not afraid. Go for it.
So then what does it look like for going back to the like growing that team? Okay, you've identified as a founder that you have these pieces of you that are not missing. You're not your strengths, right? You need to fill those in. How do you go about recruiting the right people, right? How did those firms that you worked, these amazing companies you worked at, decide, hey, we need to actually get a head of HR, and that head of HR is going to have qualities that I don't have as a founder? What
Yeah.
How do you go about recruiting these people at the top level? But then I think we should also talk about like the junior level, because going back to like, hey, do you want people that ask lots of questions, or do you maybe want a mixture of the people who are going to be a little bit more passive and just do a great job, but maybe not push things too? Like, how aggressive a culture do you want to set?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really important as a founder, which disseminates from the leadership team to any level of the organization, is what are the values and behaviors in the organization? And people talk about this, but it is such a fundamental, not just from an HR perspective, but recruiting leaders, hiring everyone across the organization, no matter what level. If you don't have a value system and how you behave as an organization, it's going to be really difficult, A, to scale yourself as a founder and find the right people to complement you, right? Because everybody needs a complement, right? So you're really building out a complementary leadership team and a broader team as well across the organization, which I think everybody is critically important. I know it's a great HR thing to say, but it's true. Like that's how great
Well,
companies are
and,
built by every single level in the organization.
and couldn't
Um,
arguably you say like everyone is important because if someone wasn't important, why did you take the time and resources to hire them in the first place? Right? Like
Absolutely.
why are they there if they aren't important?
If you have 5 or 6 key values that are lived by and breathed by your founder and the behaviors that go with those values, and then as so for example coming in as an HR leader, that's one of the first things I want to know when someone's bringing me on and they're looking at their organization, they want to hire, they want to build culture. I'm like, well, what do you believe? Like, what's important? Not just what are the values you put on your wall, but what are your behaviors? Those are so important. How do you show up? How do you communicate? On performance time, how do you behave? Do you promote just your friends? Are we promoting people that you know only that advocate at the last minute? And how those are behaviors which align to values. And so I'm a little bit, I think, forceful, I will say, in that first assessment, because for me, if as a founder, you're not showing up and living your values and behaving to those values, then they shouldn't even be on the
Yeah.
wall because it's not authentic. You're not going to hire and promote. You're not going to be able to retain people. So, Adam, when you talk about building that leadership team, that's what I look at. Like, how do I create a complementary group, whether it be founder, CEO, if they're a sales role, and then maybe you need a really fabulous process oriented operator who's just an incredible people manager. You need a really brilliant technology CTO that's maybe more strategic, but their number two has to be a strong people leader, right? Or people manager. I think one of the things that on a founding team, especially that some people undervalue, is that role of people management and that role of being able to cultivate, build a great talent, and manage teams. And I would say that is one of the most critical competencies I've seen in building a leadership team because I have a no jerks rule. I would say another word, but in terms of hiring my leaders, it's like if they don't have that humility, that vulnerability, if they can't scale themselves, if they're not kind to other people as well as being exceptional, I know that's a lot to ask for, but without that, you cannot build and scale a successful company. And you see this all the time with startups that can't quite get past the founder and the co founder. They can't quite scale themselves, or they go to the stock exchange and stock price isn't great, right? Because those values and behaviors really aren't embedded. And then it starts to show up in those moments of friction, right? When things get hard.
How do those companies then get that level of success when they're even at the stock exchange going public when they
Yeah.
when they have founders who don't do those things? I mean, they've done something right to get to that point. Is it just they hit the market timing perfectly and they're riding the wave and they basically just got straight up lucky?
I think they get lucky or they know that this is not what they're great at and they hire other great leaders around them. I mean, when you're getting ready to go public, as a company, really the person that's running your company is everybody but the CEO because they're on the investor roadshow and they're doing all the investor relations. And so really running the company, that's the legal officer, the finance officer, that's your chief human resource officer, your COO, that's your executive and what I would say actually are your directors and managers at the company. They're really getting you to that critical step. The CEO is that just they're in board meetings, investor meetings, they're getting ready for the stock exchange. They're not really running the core business. As a founder, if you know that at some point you have to replace yourself in that circle to really get a company to be successful, I think it's pretty eye opening. You realize, okay, I have to get the company to a certain size, but then not at that certain point, I need to scale myself by either moving myself into a different role or a different focus and having other people take on bits and pieces of the role. And I think that's really hard as a founder to let go. right? And it's really hard, I think, for VCs and boards to step in and lean in and say, you've been the CEO or founder here. We need to think about a different move for you. I think that's been really traditionally very, very difficult in the VC community and very controversial,
Yeah,
right?
no, I mean, because VC firms want to seem like they are very founder friendly, and that is, of course, how you get
Correct.
into the deals and those sorts of things. But arguably, and I've been in this game long enough to hopefully take the perspective and the right one. I think the right one that is basically like I want people on my board who are going to help make the tough decisions, not just be super
Yeah.
nice to me. Because in the end, my end goal as a founder is to achieve a fantastic exit. A fantastic exit
Yep.
is defined by me creating something of value in the world, right? Yes, the way to measure it, did it make a lot of money for all the investors and everybody else, sort of the way we measure things in capitalism. But in
Right.
the end, you only get there if you build an amazing, delightful product and you build a great team. You have all these other elements that stack on each other. And therefore, you want to have a
Yes.
board and hopefully maybe an
Yeah.
HR leader or someone else who can actually tell you the truth. Like, these are the areas we need to work
Yeah.
on. And then, as you're saying, like be humble enough to say, okay, let's go work on
Okay.
them and figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, what I would add to that in terms of the successful exit and all of that, which these are not opposed to each other, but it's like building an exceptional company. I always think when I work with a founder, I'm like, do you want to build an exceptional company? Because there's a difference between just getting to an exit and building something really
Yeah.
special. And that's okay. You can have both outcomes. And I think within the startup community, which I've been involved in for, like you, 15, 20 years, there are different outcomes, right? There are founders who are building to exit, and there are founders that are really want to try to build something transformational and special. And I think when you asked me how I chose, sometimes right, sometimes wrong in my career, right, is really that those businesses that were transformational were really trying to do something hard
Yep.
and special and interesting. And for me, I guess having high risk tolerance, being in a startup space for so long, like that's hard to do. It takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of and rigor to do. And it takes a lot of like just really tough, hard work to make that happen. For me, that's very interesting. But if it's not grounded in that value system, then again, it just evolves into chaos,
I, how do
unfortunately.
you explain that? How do you explain that to the people you're recruiting for your company, probably at any age to some extent, where it's like, look, because I think a lot of people have this mythological idea that like companies have this mass success overnight or they're just a failure otherwise. When I totally agree with you, like this is a 7 to 10 year journey minimum to achieve success.
Yep.
And now it's great to join early because you're getting equity at a low valuation, you're having an opportunity to grow with that company, and I think it's great for careers. But a lot of people are
Yeah.
like, well, it didn't happen over the past 6 months. Like I'm going to go to that next company that's moving really fast. What do you
Yeah.
tell those people?
So I think there's a couple things in that. I mean, I think there's the financial piece, which I'm hearing you talk about a bit, which is the exit and equity and getting in early. And that is absolutely a part of it. I think the second part is also a learning piece. Like, are you learning to be gritty and resilient by pushing through those hard moments at a startup? And then I think there's a third piece, which is like, does it align with my value system? Is this the kind of company that I want to work for long term? Is it a type of place when I show up, I feel like I belong? And I do think that's a third important element. And so you can kind of munge all those together. But I will say in the startup community, I mean, as you well know, I mean, most people are here 2 years in a startup, 2 to 3 years. That's sort of the cycle of why you get into it, myself included, right? I'm a builder, I'm a scaler. I come in for a certain type of organization when I did my startup world, right? I had to figure that out, over 20 years. But I think it's okay to come in and say, okay, I'm investing in, 2 to 3 years of this company. These are the types of things. This is my plan. These are the kind of things I want to get out of it. Equity. I want to go early. I want to be scrappy. I know I have to work a little extra hours because it's very agile. Things move very quickly. That kind of has to fit your acumen and I find and your personality a little bit too, right? I find with people that I know that are in the startup space, they love that energy. They love that push, that drive, that innovation, those new ideas. It's really exciting for them, myself included, right? I think if that's not your natural archetype or personality, startups can be really draining and really difficult to work in. So you kind of have to, I think, balance that out. I balance that out by doing sort of consulting startups consulting, right? Like I've sort of gone back and forth a bit to find that. But I think to your question, everybody has that different cycle for them. And I think it's a little bit about knowing what gives you energy, what makes you happy, what are you trying to, not every 6 months, obviously, but what do you want to get out of the next couple of years? How do you want to grow as a person? How do you want to build your career? What kind of opportunities do you want to take on? Is there somebody at the organization you want to mentor you? Like, you should come in sort of having a plan of how you want to keep evolving and learning. I mean, I remember when I took the position from startup and going into Deloitte, I was like, I want to learn about HR from the bottom up. I want to write process documents and I want to learn about healthcare. So I worked with all the big healthcare companies and had a wonderful team and experience there because I was just, I was just learning. And I thought, this is my plan for the next 2 to 3 years is just dig in deep on HR. I want to understand how to build and scale a global healthcare organization from an HR perspective. Those are my goals and meet some great people, right? Have some great mentors. So I would say to your point, as a person coming into startups or in any job, what's your plan? What do you want to learn? And be humble about the fact that you don't know everything, but try to find what you don't know and what you're curious about, what you want to learn more about.
And how do you hire, like on the other side of it, as a company, how do you hire for people who have those qualities, right? So I think team construction is a key
Mhm.
part of what I presume good founders do is they're like thinking through like what people do I want on this team to make sure it's set up the right way. How do you interview for that? What questions can you ask to figure out is that person, do they have the right level of drive, interest, energy that goes into building a high quality startup, or are they just kind of looking for a job and telling me the things I want to hear during the interview?
Yeah, I always like to ask about maybe a project they worked on that had nothing to do with their job. Like, is there a project you took on at work that you just thought was super interesting that you got involved in to do? Or tell me about a project that you worked on in your job that that you found really interesting and like why was that interesting for you? And I think you can sometimes see that archetype of that startup kind of curiosity about how things work if they talk to you about something they're passionate about or they did that might not have been in their sort of job description, if that makes sense. Like, I remember working at McKinsey and I was on this cool healthcare project that I had just volunteered as a part of this team to be a part of. It had nothing to do with my job, but I thought, wow, this is really cool. I want to learn more about this. And so I went on this project, right? It's those kinds of things that you want to see. Are they curious? Do they want to learn more about things? What are they interested in? How are they interested in growing and evolving in their career over the next couple of years? Like, if you don't come with answers about those things and what's interesting for you, then I think as an employer, like, you're not going to know, like, is this person going to be willing to take that next opportunity? Are they going to really be curious? Are they going to be flexible to where if their job isn't exactly their job description, which happens in startups quite a
Absolutely.
bit, they're going to be flexible and say, well, okay, so I was thinking it was this, it's a little bit of this, but I'm going to make the best of it, ask questions and take on this opportunity. And you sort of want that, I think, flexibility, curiosity, and willingness to just sort of try new things. I think that's that. So you can ask questions, I think, around that. People call it growth mindset. I like curiosity about life, about projects, about how they approach work, things that they're passionate about. I think that can be brought into work and really leveraged in a company if you know how to, wrangle that talent in the best way.
Do you want a team of like all strivers in a sense? Like when you're thinking through team construction, do you want a group of people who, especially as you're starting to scale a lot, right? Do you hire, like, I want some people are going to be just pushing the boundaries every day and they're going to get great work done, but might want a promotion really fast because they think they're so much better. And maybe they are actually, they're a 10x producer or something versus
Yeah.
maybe some other people who just are great overall teammates, but aren't pushing the same way. Especially the scaling company, what is the right mixture of people you should be looking for?
I think you want to balance always. I think there's been this big debate in HR about, you didn't use the word, but it's like you want these quote A players. I'm like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I think that's terrible. I mean, it's like all of us have different strengths and opportunities and skills. And whereas somebody in one position might be just over exceeding and 10xing, what they're doing, they're in the right space, the right time for who they are. It doesn't mean that the entire team is not valuable. Successful companies are not built on individuals. They're built on successful teams.
Mm,
And
absolutely.
they're built on the success of an organization working together toward a goal. That doesn't mean everybody's a striver or not a striver. It's how do you build those cohesive skills, what we call in HR competencies, values, behaviors, skills. How do you look at that and create a blend of a successful team that has all of those qualities, right? Maybe you want someone that has those big ideas and is always thinking about whiteboarding things and cool and stuff, but you probably want them to be balanced by somebody who could take those ideas
Right.
and make it happen
But-
or just stays on a whiteboard, right? And can actually digest and then translate that message to a team, right? And motivates people to do that work. So, I think building exceptional company is about having that blend, that diversity of views, ideas, people, backgrounds. Like there's been so much research around this about how building that diverse organization really drives business results. And, so many companies struggle with this in our society. And it's like, but the research is there. If you build that diverse team, different ideas, different approaches, backgrounds, neurodiverse, different places growing up, different upbringings, ages, it really drives innovation. And I think we're still very much figuring that out in the startup
That's
world.
a great segue sort of into that topic that I wanted to talk about with you is like, what does it really mean to build a diverse team? What does that look like? So I get the research shows, hey, having a diverse team leads to greater outcomes, but it's
Yeah.
also probably tough for people, right? One, it's maybe just tough to hire that diverse team, maybe find people for those positions, especially if you're a tech forward, company and you're hiring lots of engineers where your pool's already maybe drastically like smaller for male versus female or something. But just in
Yeah.
general, and I know people have their own biases, so they like to hire people that are sort of like them. How do you go
Yeah.
about proactively building that diverse team given the extra cost that goes into it? And once again, it's the long-term value, but there's sort of a cost that's
Yeah.
included that it is maybe hard for people to grasp.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple really important things. I think there's an important element is what is the type of society that we want to build. I know that's a very high level topic here, but when you're thinking about building a company, you're thinking about creating livelihood and wealth and opportunity for people, right? And taking care of their families and then having new babies and getting married and all these incredible moments in life, right? And I think as a leader, and as a founder that I have a responsibility,
Yep.
regardless of cost, to building something extraordinary that supports a community and a family and a society that I want to see. And for me, as a founder, and I think what every founder should look at is okay, start simply, what are the demographics of our workforce? What 56% of our workforce is women. Okay, so let's start there.
And that's in the US, you're talking about a company.
The United
Okay.
States, so just the United States, right? So, you talk about, cost and factor and all of this. And I think the workforce is there. But I think where sometimes founders and early startups get stuck is they call people and they get referrals and then they start to just kind of hire people like them, right? That's kind of where it starts. And I think I always tell early founders of who I've worked now with, fortunately with 5 founder CEOs in my career, but you have to start at the beginning. Because if you start at the beginning and you say, okay, I'm building a diverse set of views and opinions because I want to be innovative and successful. And I'm going to start now by embedding that in my culture. So it doesn't seem like such a quote push for people toward the end. So you start at the very beginning and you say, you know what? I know that I want half of my organization to be female or female representation. I want there to be LGBTQ plus representation, of African descent, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, mixed race. And you literally pull that data. That's one of the first things I do as an HR leader or when I'm working with a client. Let me see your data.
Yep.
I want to see what your people are. Who are your managers, your directors, your executives, your board, right? And like, where is that coming from? Then where are we going to start? Okay. And if you do that and you start to see such a big difference. So it's not as hard as it is difficult, I think, to get past bias in that initial sort of hiring. But if you set those frameworks from the beginning and you're very intentional and you say, okay, we are low in Latinx representation in our organization, that's going to be our focus
Yep.
in terms of with any manager and leader we work with, that they need to understand that we need to increase that diversity because we're creating this company that's reflective of the United States, it's reflective of our communities and of the products we're selling.
Mhm.
If we're selling a product to an organization and we're not reflecting that the community that we're serving, that's a disservice to the community, in my
How
opinion.
do we so how do you deal with the this sort of verging on sort of DEI as a topic right now, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's been a pretty hot
Yeah.
topic across the United States right now, university campuses and all these other places and in lots of companies as well. Where on one hand, it's a good argument to say, hey, look, I want to hire a diverse team because it makes for a better company. On the other hand, I can see managers saying, you know what, I just want to hire the best person for my team. And if I have a white male who's really good and an African American lady who's also really good, how do I choose the right person to really get the job done as best as possible? And when should I take into account other factors beyond sort of just skill set? And how should you look at that?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. I think first of all, you have to start off very simply with the organization that you want to build and design and say, as a company, so as a founder, for example, right? If you're a founder too, right? You want to build a company that's reflective of the workforce. You say, okay, this is the kind of company I want to build. These are my intentions. This is with hiring. I think the way that you get it, I've gotten that question a lot around, oh, we just want the best
Mhm.
person. I've got that from every company I've worked with, right? And I said, okay, so let's talk about what that best person
Totally.
looks like,
Great question.
right? What is that best person? And you take race, age, gender, and all other factors off the table. And you say, let's talk about what their qualities are. Let's talk about what their competencies are, right? And I think it's amazing when you do that. And then you say, okay, team, hiring team, managers, directors, these are the kinds of qualities we're looking for, right? But in particular, we know and are reflective on the fact that our organization is 80% white, right? Which is not reflective of the United States, which is 60% white, right? So we know we need to increase representation across other demographics. So we're going to focus and be intentional about focusing on markets, mentorship, feeder programs to make sure that we attract and are going after that diverse pool of people, right? Yes, it requires intentional thought and action, but all the best things do.
Totally. Yep, that's a good point.
Right?
But how do you what
So,
do you say then to a founder who's like, or they're trying to move fast and they're like, you know what, I want to hire for my friends because my friends are going to give me good recommendations. I don't want to spend money on recruiters. I'm not going to go to these different job fairs. Like, I'm a founder who wants to move fast and I'm going to just hire the best
yeah,
people. And sometimes the easiest path to doing that is recommendations from friends and other people I've worked with maybe in the past. And maybe my old company wasn't all that diverse. So the people I know from that last company are also not diverse. How do you
yep,
step out of that cycle when there's so many other things you're also trying to optimize for as a founder and you're just trying to get to your next fundraise in 12 months?
yeah. So I think that the number one priority for any founder is hiring. And I realize that as an HR person, that's what I'm supposed to say, but it truly
Yep.
is. Every single founder that I've worked with that's gotten stuck on scale is getting yelled at by their board is because they can't scale themselves, because they don't know how to hire outside themselves.
So-
And that is probably the biggest, I think, blocker for a founder. Yes, I understand fundraising, also important. I empathize. There's so much on the plate of a founder, CEO. I totally get that. And I don't want to take away from that. However, finding the right talent and building the right culture of an organization has to be priority one. I think every early founder needs to know that hiring, that's their first priority. And hiring right and well and reducing turnover in your organization is so much time to spend hiring and finding someone with the right qualities and values to have that flip over in 2 months because you just wanted to rush someone in the door. It is better to be intentional about that than it is to rush.
Yeah, no, that is, I want to almost like reiterate that statement or restate it and tell me if I got it right, because I think it is so, 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 so critical, which is basically you're saying like the companies that want to scale, the blocker to scale is an inability to hire, recruit, train, manage, and keep the best people on your team. If
Yes.
you don't do that, you're never going to get off that treadmill and you're never going to make that leap to the next level, which presumably everyone is shooting for if you're playing the game of building at least a venture-backed startup, or frankly, any successful company.
Yeah. I would say the role of a founder at any company size is, I'm sure, at least 50% of their time is
That
hiring.
was literally going to be one of
At
my
least.
questions. How much time do you think they spend on hiring? It's about 50, because I've heard
Yeah.
best say that is about 50%. So that's actually aligned with what
Yep.
I've heard as well.
Yep. Yep. And you just need to prepare yourself for the fact that if you want to build a product, sell a product, raise money, that is your first
Yep.
priority. And if you don't know how to hire well, you need to find other people to help you
Totally.
hire
Well,
well.
and
Because that's a
you need to build a culture around hiring well too. So I mean, I'll just use Levy as an example, and we have a long way to go to be really, really good at this. But I was on vacation last week, and we're hiring a lot of people. We're growing, which is wonderful. But there's someone who his interview with me, because I interview every person right now, and I'm actually curious if you think that's good for founders to do and when they should stop doing that. But I still do. And I said, hey, I don't want to wait a week and a half. It was almost 2 weeks from when he interviewed with the other person. I wasn't out that long, but it just timing worked out. And I was like, no, like let's schedule it while I'm on vacation. Here's my time frame where I know I'll be back in my hotel. I can spend time. He said, are you
Yep.
sure? I don't want to bother you. You're busy. I'm like, no. The most important thing I can do is hiring. Like I don't have other things scheduled, but I will spend time on this because I want to keep this moving quickly. You're someone we'd love to have on the team. I keep it.
Yeah.
So for me, I agree with that and try to build a whole pipeline. We have a whole set of questions. We try to be very systematic about it and continue to improve it. But totally agree. Going to the question then again, like when is the time when founders, when do they start stepping out of it? So to give you an idea, just keep using Levy as an example. I'm the third interviewer out of four that we do for every job that we have at Levy today. So I'm not doing every interview because some people get
Yeah.
boosted out of the process well before this. They get to me. But when should founders stop? I know some companies are famous. The founders interviewing people up to like 500 plus people. I agree with that. If I'm still doing that, you call me up and be like, Adam, you're crazy. But when is the
I'll
right
tell you
time?
that.
When is the right time to stop?
Stop interviewing.
So already you think,
So yeah. So I would say, just kind of ballparking it, I would say up to 100 people. As a founder, you should be interviewing directors and above
hmm,
only and executive team.
after
That's
100 or even below 100?
I would say once you have established your leadership team as a founder. So whether they're directors, VPs, chiefs, whatever that level is of almost, your leadership team. For me, it's incredibly important a founder is a part of and hires all of those key
Yeah.
founding leaders. I would say then the next level after that, where your VP is, let's say, hiring a director on their team, then I would say to ensure the culture kind of follows through and disseminates, especially if you have a new leadership team, then I would say, yes, you as a CEO being involved in helping them for their lieutenant, if that's okay to say, and on their teams. But after that, once you have your leadership team established, then I would really encourage founders to hire maybe their leaders and their VPs and directors if you're involved in sort of some of those key hires, whether it's a CTO and maybe their VP of engineering they want you to be involved in, or kind of that next level of leadership. But after that, I would encourage founders to step away because if you've done your job as a founder, you've disseminated your culture, values, founder led passion into your leaders. Those leaders have disseminated into their leaders, and then it should flow through, right? So I would say to be very, I know I'm not giving you a direct answer, but I would say those two levels are very important, in my opinion, for a founder. But after that, a good gut check for yourself as a founder is, are they hiring people? Are my
Yep.
leaders hiring people out of talent? If not, I haven't done my job
Yeah.
to hire the right leaders or mentor or coach them to where they understand what's important to me in this company. So it's a good accountability check. If I see a founder start getting involved in like managers, associates, analysts, I think they don't trust their leaders and or they haven't done a good job of disseminating what's unique and special about this company for them to their leaders. And so that's not trickling down. It's like, I think the HR is like you kind of want to bottle that secret sauce of like what is so incredible about that founder and this company, and then help that founder CEO disseminate it across the company, right? So
How
yeah.
do you then, so I mean, so the predicate it sounds like to do this the right way is you have to be like, I've disseminated this explanation of our culture, who we are, and then hopefully hired the right senior people who can uphold the levels of what I expect as a founder and leader
Yes.
and do that
Yep.
job and do it well. Is that sort of the predicate that you feel like you have people in place who can uphold things at that level? And then you slowly back away from the various groups at the lower levels. And then
Yes.
how do you then, as from a cultural perspective in building, when or how does the founder, so obviously a one-on-one meeting when you're doing interview with people is really difficult and time consuming. What should a
Yeah.
good founder be doing as you start scaling? Is it, how do you keep that cultural mentality? Yeah, sure, you're having, meetings with your leadership team, sure. But how do you
Yeah.
keep disseminating that throughout the company? Because it's not always coming from your leadership team. So like, how do you do that as a
Right.
founder to keep that cultural
Yeah.
balance going across the entire team?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So first of all, like obviously founders should be speaking at and talking about culture and vision at every all staff meeting, right? That's kind of table stakes. I think from there, I would encourage founders on a quarterly basis to go, at least on a quarterly basis, to go within the different teams, show up for lunches, have the team into the, if you're in the office or having a virtual session, they should, the founder should be that culture carrier, right? And teams should get enough time to where at least every quarter, the founder is going with a different team, let's say engineering team or people's HR team or marketing team, and just spending time with them. Maybe they have their offsite and the founder comes in and answers questions and they all go out to lunch or dinner together. I know that may seem time consuming for a founder, but it really helps disseminate that unique culture to the teams. It shows the company that the founder cares and is invested in the culture, is invested in them, and is there to answer questions, be available. And then what I also really love to do is do some founder meetups with different people in the organization. So maybe they're not a VP or director, maybe they're just, a manager on the CX team. And, they have a one-on-one, almost like, multi-skip level, but it's really all about checking in with people in your organization and being accessible and available. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So, to your point, as you scale past that hiring of your key leaders and their leaders, then it's really okay. How do I make sure that I'm investing culture in key parts of the business? And one of the key partners of a founder CEO is the CHRO or chief people officer, which can say, "Hey, Adam, just so you know, I think there's some key things that you should be aware of or a part of that are happening in the organization. So we just did a org on this. I think it'd be great if you went to their offsite in 2 weeks and had dinner with this group of people." And I think that's not just the job of the chief people officer, but one of the ways that partnership is so important is really to be that pulse of the organization and be able to help the founder, CEO really dig in those places so that the company continues to thrive and be happy and grow and really address those things quickly that come up.
So Anna, you actually bring up a really, really good point, and one thing I'd love for you to help define for people, which is what does it mean to have a great chief people officer, head of HR, and when should you bring that person on board? And I'll add my own personal biases here a little bit, which you can probably push against to a large extent, but it's like HR to some extent feels like it's overhead. I mean, like HR people, hopefully no offense meant, like they aren't building your product. They aren't going to helping you go to market. They are certainly helping you hire and build the right team, which per our previous discussion is utterly critical. It's like foundational to the other two pieces, to having a great product and having great go to market, is having that team. But it feels sometimes like it can be overhead. And it's just this extra layer between the founder and the team, and it's someone else to go complain to. If you're pissed off at the founder, you can go complain to the head of HR. So what does it mean to have a great head of HR? What are those skill sets you're looking for? What is that person supposed to be doing to really help build this great team and not and be an accelerant to success, not a roadblock?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's different elements of a head of HR or an HR leader at different size and scales of startups. So I would say at 100 people or less, having a great director of HR is fantastic. Many of the needs in an organization of that size, you're building a lot of core programs. So to your point around at that size and scale, how that accelerates, I would say, the speed and growth of the company. So number one is on the recruiting side, obviously hiring and bringing in great talent. That's one of the most key elements of an early stage startup. HR leader is knowing how to hire, setting the right hiring processes, the right systems, the right tools. I think the second piece is around benefits, compensation, making sure you have the right benefit structure, making sure you have the right compensation structure for your organization, making sure you have the right performance management, elements that you can embed within the organization. I think it's a lot of right size HR for the right size of the organization. And I say that because, if you're working in a startup, you have to be really flexible as an HR leader. But I think a sign of a good HR leader that size is someone who's built really great
Mm,
programs that can scale, right? You want to have a great HR system. You want to have great payroll processing. You want to have really thoughtful benefits. You want to have a great compensation structure. You want to have a great equity plan that's clear and understood. You want to have a really thoughtful and intentional, diverse hiring practices, right? And you're setting that into the framework from the very beginning. So for me, that level of HR, you're handling so many foundational things that need to be done right in order for that to eliminate people's time to give it back to the business. I would say the other really important part of an HR leader is as a coach and employee relations, really helping resolve issues that bubble up into an organization. We want to empower managers as much as possible to handle those issues and not, you asked earlier about HR being the go between. It's less about that. And it's more helping people understand how to coach, how to resolve issues. It's really training managers and leaders and founders on how to handle those tricky issues or what things they should think about strategically and how you design your organization. That's a skill set that just doesn't exist in the other members in the
mm,
leadership team. That's really rare when it's done well. That doesn't mean that all leaders can't have and they should be a part of building people and culture and hiring. I never thought, or I don't believe that that should just be sectioned off into HR as overhead. It should be a shared responsibility. But your HR leader is really the expert in those things. And that's why they're brought in, right? They're brought in to help you, Adam, think about how you scale
mhm.
yourself. What's that plan over the next 3 months that you build with your HR business partner to help you do that?
Yep. But it's so a question then for you on that front, right? How do you hire properly for that? So what I mean is like,
Yeah.
like, look, every company would probably be overjoyed and really lucky to have you on their team. But my guess is you're probably pretty expensive to have on a team unless you're a really big or scaling company. So if you're an
Yeah.
earlier, smaller startup, do you hire a really junior HR person who you hope is going to scale up and learn as they grow? Do you try to hire a more
Yeah.
senior person? What How do you do this the right way when you're
Yeah.
cash or financially constrained?
Yeah. So I think to your point around, hiring at like your series A, series B, let's say 100, 200 people, you're really looking for a really talented HR director that can build those programs. And they probably have done this as a career choice for companies of 250 or less. Like that's their skill set.
Mm,
Like I think within HR, there are different skill sets at different scale levels. So to your point, my superpower is pre-IPO to public, right? Where the foundational elements and programs have been developed, but now we're talking about learning and development, advanced compensation, equity strategies, those types of things from my experience. That's where I'm really talented and really fabulous at. There are other HR leaders that are fabulous at that early stage, build the foundational programs, put in a PEO or payroll system or other amazing company to help out like Levy. And you guys, that's their secret
mhm.
spot. I would say as you scale and grow, as you get past that 250, there's another inflection point at 500 and 1,000 as 1,000 plus, right? And there's an evolution of just that HR leader's skill and what their real acumen is at, right? And so I think, this I've learned as an HR leader, know others have too. Where are they uniquely positioned based on their experience to do, right? To be able to say that. So to your point, finding a really wonderful director, senior manager of HR, that 100-person level, that's all you need, right? Because you're building those foundational building blocks. Doesn't mean the job's any less hard. It is really hard because you're building those foundations. And then you get to that next level of HR leader, and they may be able to put in, let's say, more advanced compensation strategies or equity planning or pre IPO readiness, which is a whole other ball of wax, right? Or getting ready to actually be on the stock exchange in the next 12 months. So those are different skills and qualities that you just have to look for in a leader. So if I'm looking for an HR leader of a startup that's a series A, series B, I'm looking for a great go getter. I'm looking for someone with a great overall HR business skills. I'm looking for someone who might have a stronger acumen toward hiring because I'm going to need to bring them in and probably talent acquisition lead. Like those are my first two hires, right? As well as recruiting. So you just have to kind of know that, I guess, from experience and learnings on what's the best skill set for that level as an HR.
And how do you go about dealing with, and this goes to the HR position, but also frankly, all the positions you hire for as you grow and scale as a company, when you have to sort of top someone, right? And hire someone more senior above them. Because I'm sure you hire, keeping on the HR position, you hire this great director of HR, and now they took you double in scale and they think they did a great job doing it. And maybe they did. But also, of course, there's a lot of other elements for why that company doubled in size. It wasn't just because HR was great. You're like, hey, I now need to
Yeah.
bring in the next senior person above you. How do you have that conversation? How do you do it the right way? So it's not just the HR roles, it's so many different roles where that needs to happen. And that can be a really tough conversation.
Yeah, I've had it a number of times and it is really hard and it's really tough, especially with someone that's been so successful at building and scaling a company to that size. I think the first thing to keep in mind is intention. What's your intention in the conversation? And I think where a lot of people get it wrong is they take it from a very like aggressive, we just need to cut you kind of approach rather than an intention of just like empathy, thanks, and gratefulness for all the work that they've done and generosity on package. I mean, it doesn't, from an organizational perspective, someone who's helped build you to that scale level of an organization that you can give references to, that you can help them find another job. That's always where you want to go, right? Because they have contributed so much. So it is really difficult. I think most people know when a person is tapped out. It's just most people don't want to have the
Right. Well,
conversation.
and they may not know it
because
themselves, right?
well,
They might not know it themselves. It might be obvious to other people, but the individual might not really recognize it themselves.
So yeah, so you said something earlier about, this view of HR being overhead and all of that. And I just want to challenge that a little bit. I think that HR is an integral part of building the company. And I think that even at an early stage of startup, a lot of the work that the founders and other members of teams try to do at the beginning is HR related. And a lot of times when you come in, you have to clean all of that up as an HR leader. So I think it's just like building a great team, right? Like you have to build the competencies and skills and expertise to really scale the company, right? And the only way you can do that, I think, is by adding that critical people element in. So
It's a great plug for HR, and one that I can very much buy in. And I know Levy is an example. We don't have HR today, but we'll probably need an HR leader soon. We're almost 40 people ourselves. So it's getting to be that point for sure. But so another big question that comes up certainly for us, and I think most companies, is the idea of sort of total compensation or compensation and rewards. And what does that look like? And how do you deal with that as the company scaling, growing? I have this debate even with our own team where it's like, hey, look, I don't feel like I'm getting paid enough. And I'm on the other hand, like, but you took the job. Like no one forced you to say yes to the job offer that was at hand with the compensation
yeah.
you knew that would be there. How do you adjust those things and think through total rewards and compensation for people joining any company, startup, scaling startup, you name it?
Yeah. So I always believe that at minimum you have to be paying people at the midpoint of the market, startup or not. And when you do your compensation analysis, right, you're going to be looking at other companies of your size and scale to make sure that your compensation is to market, right? So as a startup, what I usually do, one of the first things as an HR leader too, is I look at compensation is I run benchmarks and I pull data and I make sure that what we're paying our employees, let's say, up to 250 people, for example, we're paying at market for that subgroup of people. Now, the expectation setting that you have to do when you bring people in that we have been a bigger company accepting your offer is, hey, we're not going to pay at X company. We know you guys pay at the 99th percentile of the market, right? Like we're a startup and our benchmarks are other companies like
Yep.
us. And this is what we pay. So as an HR leader, I spend a lot of time actually unraveling a lot of vagueness around compensation. And I actually think most companies should be very transparent about that. And one of the first things I usually do when I come in is I present the comp analysis to the company. And I say, this is where our compensation is. This is where we benchmark against other companies. This is what we pay our benchmarks for equity. and I deliver compensation bands to all leaders for their teams for hiring. Because that's just one of those things, in my opinion, where there's a lot of stigma around it, especially in startups. And a lot of times when I come in, founders will say, "Oh, we're going to pay at, a really low end of the market. We're going to give a lot of
Mhm.
equity." And I said, that trend is
Yeah.
over. Like, and people are no longer going to take, low pay and a lot of equity and, sweat equity in this company. You have to pay people at the middle of the market for your size and scale. And on top of that, you have to add equity because they would get a bonus any other place, right? That they would go to. So I think it's all about being fair. It's all about communication, and it's all about making sure you have the right data, compensation data, and communicating that out to your entire employee population. But I find that always the stickler on that is the founder.
Yep, totally. And I can imagine that. I like to think Levy, given what we do, we've tried to do all of those elements. But I'm curious too. Like, so how do you help people understand? Okay, so middle part of the market, but what does that look like in the sense that, like, do you look at U.S. wide, or do you say, hey, look, maybe because our company's based in Boise, Idaho, I don't really
Yeah.
care what they pay in New York and in San Francisco. I care about
Yeah.
what the middle of the market is for Boise, Idaho. Like, how do you take that into account and kind of explain these different nuances and levels to people when they might do like, well, I'm going to do my own comp analysis and pull up one or two articles for my title and role, and it says people are
Yeah.
paid double, and therefore it's unfair. And I'm like, yeah, but you live in Boise, Idaho. No offense to Boise, it's
Yeah.
just lower.
So, I mean, I think there's a couple different compensation philosophies on that. I think what I have seen things shift is from a very regionalized compensation perspective to a national to sort of coasts mid, sort of like segmented different
So like
areas.
like tier
Um,
one cities, tier two cities, tier three sort of thing like that, or
Exactly. So, from a compensation perspective, let's say you live in Texas, you would be benchmarked against a national framework for compensation for your role, level, and function, right? But on the coasts, where they traditionally pay more, from a compensation band perspective in HR, you might have a 10 or 15% increase on that salary if you hired someone in those
mm,
areas. So, from a compensation perspective, I think you can make that as complicated and specific or as simple as possible. I think for startups, because I always try to say keep it simple because you're not thousands of employees. You don't have these very specific rules and subsets. So usually what I'll say is, okay, if there's two kind of philosophies. Number one is a more nationalized model where you add on percentages marks based on, higher pay areas, or you have different regions and you share those regional benchmarks. So you say, okay, if you're in, Idaho or Iowa, maybe your compensation is 7 to 10% less based on if we hired this person in this role. So it can get complicated, but I think for most startups, at most all the way up to public company, and like I said, usually you do a comp analysis every year as an HR leader. You present the results or other big inflection points. Let's say you're right about to go public, or you just did a big raise, or you just hired a whole bunch of people and you're out of your benchmark. You want to stay as accurate as possible within those ranges.
and how do you deal with, and this is a little bit of a personal one, but I'll talk about, you're kind of talking about it, but like cost of living adjustments is one thing that people do sort of based what we're kind of talking about, different tiered locations, it's different costs. So at Levy, we actually used to do cost of living adjustment. And we found that a lot of people found it really unfair that someone in New York was going to make 25% more than they were, even though the actual
Yeah.
take home for that person in New York was probably less than the person living in Chicago. People found it
Yeah.
incredibly unfair. So we actually did away with cost of living, where it's like, I'm tired of having this discussion with people. We try to make it
Yeah.
as fair as possible. But the problem now for us is just one example, and we're, by the way, a fully remote company. So we hire people
Yeah.
wherever they're located, is we've lowered our base compensation number and just sort of said, hey, look, this is it. And it might mean we don't hire in New York and San Francisco. I mean, that's sort of part of the trade-off. How do companies deal with that though, right? Because it is this debate. It's like, should we pay different levels based on different people's living standards? Or just say we're going to pay one salary and it might mean we miss out on candidates in certain locations.
I think that you have to offer what's comparable in that market. And you shouldn't, so if you're going to try to hire, just trying to think of a good example, customer experience or customer support
Mhm.
person, right? I would say, well, why are you hiring them in a high cost area? It might not make any sense from a labor perspective and from a view. Maybe it's better to get that talent in a lower cost location, right? That's one example. It's what's called labor arbitrage in HR. And as you get bigger as a company, these are things you have to think about is where do you hire roles and where do you hire from them so it makes the most sense for your company financially, but also from a talent pool perspective, right? As you know, I mean, hiring engineers, you should hire them
Mhm.
anywhere, right? Anywhere you can find an engineer, you should hire them because there is less talent or diverse talent, particular talent that you want for a certain role. I think you have to be very flexible. So I think from a compensation perspective, you have to be thoughtful about where you're hiring your talent, understanding the cost of that market, and the fact that you may be paying more in a premium market like the San Francisco, the Bay Area, or New York or the East Coast, because unfortunately those are higher cost areas.
And how much do you do? So speaking of individual compensation, how much fluctuation do you put into different roles? Right? Do you say usually, hey, look, we're going to hire a people manager, whatever level, doesn't matter. I'm willing to pay for someone who has many more years of experience, maybe 20% more for them or less, or do you just say, you know what, everyone should be the same compensation band? If they're people managers, everyone's the same compensation band. Maybe once again within different tiered locations, there's a difference, but there's not a difference based on do I like this person more or do they have a better skill set or how much fluctuation do you allow in compensation on an
So I think you build a band. And again, I would never call myself a compensation expert, just lots of learnings over the years. Is you have a compensation band for that level and that role and that function. So if you're in customer experience and you're a manager and you're in Texas, there is a band. There would be a band that would be created for that role, right? So when you talk about different levels of experience, if they're applying for that customer experience manager in Texas, they're going to have a band, a compensation band. And within that, you usually have some flexibility so that as you give people money every year, if you want to give people a cost of living adjustment or you want to do an annual raise or a raise every 18, every 6 to 12 months, whatever that looks like for your cycle, then you have flexibility in that band, right? And if somebody exceeds expectations, you have a little bit more room to pay them based on a performance based cycle as well, too.
Okay.
So you do have a band in order to pay that person, and the manager has flexibility. I think what's important though is that you have an HR partner to make sure there's no pay
Yeah.
inequity. Because what will happen is that you might have somebody who is not a minority who's being paid at a certain amount. And then you compare them against people that are underrepresented communities, and they may not be paid as much due to bias, whether intentional or not. So, from an HR perspective, as in every performance cycle, myself and my team will run actually a pay equity analysis on any recommendations before they go live because we want to make sure there's not a big percentage points between two of the same candidates in the same role. Let's say within that same compensation band, we're not seeing a huge big in compensation for that individual. And that's really important. And you see a lot around pay equity issues. And that's, I think, because there is that lack of diligence at that level.
Yeah, no, that's smart. I mean, we do something. We actually have gone maybe as far for even further than that, where we just say that there is no difference. You certain level for a
Right.
certain role. This is what you get paid. We don't negotiate. I don't want to spend time negotiating with people. I also don't want to have the biases that inherently come in because you end up having, I think, historically, men are more willing to negotiate, and so therefore men
Correct.
end up making more because they're willing to ask. And so we just at Levy, we just have a policy. We don't negotiate. This is what it is, and that's that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it ensures that equity, right? And that diligence. And I think if you have a consistent framework and accountability measure for that, you can really ensure that you don't have those pay equity issues. On the other side, I would say starting from the beginning of that is really important because as you get larger as a startup, those pay equities issues can accelerate. And I've been at some companies having to come in and make a number of pay adjustments because there was never that level of rigor or data analysis or around pay and compensation. And it happens quite a
And,
bit, actually.
and you're saying
So it's important.
you're saying when there's a difference or you have to make those adjustments, it's saying like there's some people same level, but somebody's way lower than they should be, and you're like, even if it hasn't gotten out yet, it's going to get out at some point and we need to adjust it. Wouldn't a founder just say, well, lucky us, we're paying this person way less, but we're saving cash. Like why should we pay a little extra here if they don't know, if that employee doesn't know the difference?
Yeah, and I think that I've definitely heard that, and I've definitely heard we can't afford it, and I was like, well, you can't not afford it because from a compliance perspective, you're going to get into huge, huge issues
Right.
here, and you're putting yourself and your company at legal risk. And I think it's like I said, I always say just most times it's unintentional. It just they're not aware, they don't have the data. I like to give people the best intention, right? And just present the data. Now, if they don't do anything about the data, that's different,
Well, totally.
right? It's a different conversation. Um, but I do think anytime I have brought up in the past, I think that those things have been adjusted very quickly. It was just unintentional. You build so fast, you don't have the right structures or HR process in place. And so to your point around what makes a good HR leader, it's those checks and balances. It's that accountability. It's that combination of coaching and holding the organization accountable to operating with integrity.
And also to go back to your point, I mean, it's not just the compliance issues where if you're so out of whack on your compensation to different people at the same sort of different people at the same level, it's also you don't want to lose good people, right? To your point of like building a great team, if that person finds out they're making significantly less, suddenly you have an issue on
Yeah.
your hands there too. And sure, you maybe saved $20,000 in difference in pay scale with someone for a period of time, but now you've either angered them dramatically or you end up losing them, which is far more costly. You might actually know this. Like, what is the cost to like? Isn't there just like 1.5 times their annual salary to replace an employee, something like that, where like it's very
Yeah.
costly to lose people.
Yeah. It definitely is to lose, especially to lose really talented employees. And I would say, in addition to just, the compliance pieces of this and pay equity, it's also, well, what kind of company do you want to build?
Mm.
Do you want to build an exceptional company? Do you want to build a great company? Do you want to build a values driven company that's built with integrity or not? I mean, and I think that's also for me, that goes back to what are the values of the founder?
Yep.
What do they value? Do they value their people? And that is one way you can definitely see, does that show up in our behavior, right? Do we have equitable representation at a leadership level, at a board level? Are we promoting equally? Are we paying equally? Are we hiring equally? Right? Like all of these, do we have robust childcare policies to support working parents? Do we have options for IVF and fertility for LGBTQ plus community and for those that can't have, who children? Those kinds of things require an intentionality. And I think that's where HR can come in and really drive huge value, is in that not just that humanity, but balancing humanity with the business. I know as deeply as much about the businesses, and you talk about, having a slight domain expertise for healthcare because of my passion for healthcare, right? I want to know about the business, but I also want to help patients and their families, just like my employee base. So I think part of a great HR leader is balancing that humanity and advocating for the voices that maybe are not always seen and heard, because that's what builds an exceptional company. And I think that's the job in a lot of ways of HR, is to be that voice and that advocate and not just speak, but act.
And how does a great HR leader or founder balance some of the compensation pieces with also sort of the other part to me that's tied to compensation, promotions? When do you, are there rules or heuristics you put in place for like when to promote people, how often, right? Because you might say to people, hey, look, we need you to start at a certain level to prove that you actually know this role and you can actually do it the way you claim, especially if it's something a little
Yeah.
bit different. But I want to promote fast, or I want to promote what I tell my team in it. And I very much believe this is like, look, it's incumbent, of course, on an individual to show that they are as good as they think they are, no matter what. But it's also incumbent upon us as a company to recognize that and promote you
Yeah.
before you start getting itchy and antsy that you're not being recognized for the contribution you're making to the company. But you also don't want to do it too fast, because then sometimes you see people who like, well, that person got promoted, why am I not getting promoted? And like it becomes a
Yeah.
whole promotion political battle. How do you deal with that? What are the right heuristics for promotions?
So I think you have to have that baked into your performance management system, and you have to have it clearly communicated to the organization. So I think from what I've seen, and again, this is the startup ecosystem, which is different from larger companies. But I would say within the startup community, there's an expectation of a promotion every
Mhm.
year. It's pretty, most people want to be promoted every year or at least see some forward momentum. So traditionally what I will, say when people talk to me about, promotions coming in is like, well, here's our performance competencies that we look for every single level, right? So it's clear and communicated to the organization. Same thing, communicate the organization. We'll look at promotions once a year. It's through our performance management system. You're nominated by your manager and your leader, and then it's calibrated with HR, right? I know that sounds very like a lot of work, but you really want to make sure there's that level of kind of accountability. And then I think establishing expectations with someone when they come in. If they're in a, you know, if they're in a role where they're exceeding expectations, they should have been leveled differently. I always say just make the
Yeah.
adjustment. It doesn't matter if it's on a performance cycle or not. You're a startup. We need to move quickly. But for somebody who's in role and operating in role well, they can be on an annualized cycle to take a look at their compensation, their performance, what they want to do as an organization. But at least annually, you're really throughout the year, your manager should be having those conversations every week, to be honest. So there should be no surprise. But from a company perspective, actually paying out once a year. So prior companies, I've done a biannual process. So if somebody misses
Yeah.
that kind of year mark, like fall and spring process, so make sure everybody has that opportunity if they've been with a company every year, whether they're assessed in the spring or the fall for promotion, compensation adjustment. We look at all those things at least once a year for each person.
And are there, so that's sort of about like, are there certain systems or tools you use to track that properly? Like, how do you like to do that the right way and make sure you're gathering the data and you're the person's getting the feedback they need and on a fast enough cycle? I mean, part of my pet peeve with a lot of certain systems that are out there is that they aren't fast enough to give you actionable feedback. So, even if I'm doing it biannually, man, if my manager gives me feedback from 6 months ago, like, well, it's been 6 months. Like, it's not fast enough time frame for me to make an adjustment, and you're only just now telling me that I'm not doing a great job or something. How do you deal with that?
Exactly. It's been an interesting evolution the last 20 years around performance. And I think a lot of companies are actually now successfully getting rid of performance management, but that puts a lot of onus on the manager to make sure they're having these consistent follow-up conversations, delivering feedback, all of that in a really consistent way, which most managers that come into a company, especially a startup, that might be a first-time manager, they don't have a lot of that training. So a lot of the job on HR is that coaching and training, making sure people understand how to give
Mhm.
feedback, document things. So when you talk about, systems and tools, I mean, I've had good luck with Culture Amp, to be honest, in terms of their performance system, adding in their competency framework, having that roll into their performance cycle. And you can give feedback and deliver feedback through the system at any time. So it's pretty flexible. But I found the biggest part of using it is adoption. People want to use Google Docs, or they just want to write down something in Drive and not share it, or they don't know what to talk to HR or their manager about. So I find that performance is a lot of education, training, and coaching managers and leaders on really how to be a good manager and how to deliver great feedback. And much of that job, unfortunately, falls on a to do to help those managers kind of become the best managers they can
Yeah,
be.
and it's actually a good reminder that, I mean, at Levy, we have a fairly robust system for what we want to do for managers, but it's a reminder to me that we have new people who are becoming managers and like, I want to make sure they're getting the training they need and the information
Yeah.
for what it really means to be a good manager. It's a great point. So kind of the last two things I want to talk about briefly. Like, one, I know you talk a lot about analytics and some of your background and skill sets. Like, what analytics are you looking at? Or, I mean, you've talked about it maybe in different places, but like, let's round it up. Like, what are analytics for HR that good leaders are paying attention to?
Yeah. So, first of all, the demographics of an organization, and understanding your demographics of your employee base at all levels and roles across the organization to really understand from, first of all, like, are we building this type of diverse organization that we should be building, right? Are we reflective of the US workforce? Are we in the technology space? Are we exceeding our benchmarks for hiring, for example, female engineers and product leaders? Are we exceeding our benchmarks or meeting them for female leaders in the organization and LGBTQ plus and people of African descent, people of color. So that's really important. That first step is just show me the data. Like I want to understand our demographics and be able to report on that to the founder and make recommendations, and also to work individually with each of the hiring managers and each of the leaders and directors of the organization if they don't have the diverse workforce that they should. So I think that's one key piece of analytics and being able to track and manage that effectively to hiring and promotions. Number two, looking at your hiring and promotion rates. Are you promoting equitably? Are you hiring equitably? If not, what does that data say? And then again, sharing that out with solutions. I always try to come with a solution. Like, this is what we're seeing in the data. This is where we want to be. Here are some solutions on how to get there. Here's your role. Here's my role. This is how we're going to make this happen. Right. And I think a lot of the hiring statistics as well too, right? So how long is it taking to close on a hire? Who's the hiring manager? Sometimes I find it's not recruiting, it's the hiring manager most of the time, or a combination of the two. There's always improvement on both sides, right? So looking at that data is, I think, also really important. People engagement scores, people talk a lot about them, but I think it's good to get the sentient score across the organization and really being able to understand, are there different groups that are just really unhappy, that are happy? How do you diagnose the signal from the noise? That's usually a part of the people operations team will go ahead and take a look at that data and say, okay, so these groups are not as happy. These people are not happy with their managers. And you really diagnose that data to understand where, as leaders and managers, can we lean in to help this company thrive and grow? And where does the founder CEO need to take on some of this cultural work, right? If you have a team that's really underperforming and really unhappy, and you really want to retain them, right? And they need to be happier, right? That's a combo job of HR, the manager, the leader, and sometimes the founder getting involved and saying, hey, and maybe it's because a leader recently left and you need to do some TLC with that group. So I think understanding people engagement holistically is also really important too. And then I look at compensation and benefits data. So how are we paying people? Who's utilizing our benefits? I always poll around benefits. What benefits would you like? What are we missing? What's the demographics of our population? Do we have people that are going to have babies in the next couple of years? So we need to make sure we have robust childcare policies. And then our affinity groups. Do we have a place where people can belong here? Do we have a place for people to share who they are and their voice? So it's not just diversity and including them in policies and procedures and promotions and hiring. Do they feel like they belong
Yep.
here? And I think that holistically is just some of the data I look at as an HR.
How often do you like to do employee surveys? And like, what does that look like the right way? We've thought about it, Levy, for different ways we can do it the right way, but what does it look like from your perspective? Like, how often, what are good surveys? Because of course, as with any data, right? The decisions you make is only as good as the data that you capture. And of course, the data you capture is predicated on asking the right questions and doing it the right way. So are there certain lessons learned?
So I think a couple lessons learned. Number one is, I think showing progress against results is really important. And I think where I've seen organizations fail is when they have all this great engagement data. You put the systems in place and then every quarter nothing's moving or changing. That's pretty humbling for the leadership team, and kind of just, the word I'm looking for, disincentivizing for the employees, because they're saying, well, I told you honestly what I need and you're not taking any action. So for me as a chief people officer and also as the founder of Lenhardt Partners, that's one of the big things we look for in clients, is not just taking in the data, but what are you doing about it and how do you create action against it? So to answer your question, I've done engagement surveys a couple of different ways. I've done them, for example, around key moments in the employee life cycle. So after performance management, after benefits, or right before benefits open enrollment. I think those things really matter to get people's opinions and views on how those key moments went. But I usually like to do quarterly deeper dive engagement surveys and then present the results in all staff and the actions that we're taking and who's accountable for them. And then do that kind of on a quarterly basis so we can track how we're doing and how we're doing against certain set scores. And I think asking a similar set of questions is really important so you can benchmark them. So having a list of, let's say, 20 15, 20 key questions that you ask. So it's not too time intensive for an employee, but you get the same benchmarks, I think is important too.
Do you make them anonymous or okay?
Yes. And I think that's always been an important factor for employees I've worked with is that they don't feel like they can be honest unless they can be
Mhm.
anonymous. That's not great. You'd rather have people be honest about how they feel about things. At least I would as an HR leader. But you can usually tell the trend by department or by group
Yep.
of people. And so you can address it more at a team
Oh,
basis.
so you would so you do gather like, hey, what team are you a part of? Or you capture
Correct.
the team level data, but not the individual.
Yep, exactly.
Got it. That's actually a great point. So the kind of my last sort of two questions, and I'll start with one that's a little bit more controversial to some extent, but like, we talked a lot about building sort of warm and fuzzy, wonderful companies that are diverse, inclusive, people are really happy, all of the good stuff. But yet when I look at a lot of the examples of cultures that are maybe most in the news, and maybe they're most in the news because of their challenges and issues, but also because they've been really successful. So you think about these big companies that are unfortunately, I think, from a diverse perspective, run many cases and founded by white males. But you have Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all these other companies, Apple, right, who have these kind of hard charging cultures that are sort of well known for really pushing. Tesla, of course, another great example, in SpaceX, right, where they have founders who are pushing the boundaries in every single way. They're not known for being warm and fuzzy, but man, they probably are well known for making all their employees really rich and really setting up their careers for success. Right, if you're an early employee at Tesla or an early employee at Apple, you could write your ticket to any job where you wanted to go. So what are the right takeaways from companies like that, and the things and other things that should be in the conversation and maybe just aren't because they're not as either quite as big a company or because they're just not as controversial, where you have maybe more diverse leaders. What are the right things that, from an entrepreneurial excellence perspective, we should be taking from these sort of big publicly traded sort of startups to every other business that's out there?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. So I think that, while I have espoused, I think virtues of that may not that may some may be reflected in that group and some may not be reflected in the group. I think that you have to have a toughness and resilience in HR to build and just because you're continually fighting and advocating for both the employee and the employer. So it's an incredibly difficult position to be in. I think that when you're talking about big companies that have successfully gone public, whose leaders may not be known for those values or virtues, I would want to boil it down to, what are the things that they have done that we could emulate that don't go against our value system or our culture? And I will say it's completely dependent on the person, right? Like some people might be okay going to an organization that has that sort of hard driving, culture that may not espouse to some of the same kind of values and behaviors that said that there's no blame in that. It's just a culture that they have built. Would I work there? No.
Yeah, fair.
But I think as an individual, going back to coming into startups and working in startups, and again, I've learned this over 20 years. You have to know that kind of culture and value system that you find is important, that matters to you, that clicks for you, where you feel like you belong. And it should be okay for you to say, that's not the right place for me and not go there. So, to your point earlier around what can we take from these big companies, some of their agility, their quick innovations, their ability to look at problems differently, right? But I think those qualities you could also have in a founder that is humble
Mhm.
and vulnerable
Yep.
and communicates well, right? So I would just challenge that notion of this sort of Silicon Valley hard driving male CEO. I want to believe that we're moving into a different space and that this instead I want to hear us talk about Jane Fraser at Citigroup or Mary Barra over at General Motors or Oprah or Greta Gerwig, who just came out with, I think, the highest grossing movie of all time, Barbie, right? So there are these other examples, but I think that the media doesn't always focus on them because they might not be noisy and they might not be controversial. It might just be running a really great
Yeah,
business.
no, it's a great point. And that's in the end, I think what we all should strive for is building these companies that are truly excellent in every single way. And that will have I truly believe will have a higher chance of success and outcome. Now, look, it might not be the one in a million that becomes a multi-billion or even trillion-dollar company right now. But if you want to have a higher chance at like overall good success, I think doing all the things that we discussed is more likely. Now, if you're swinging for the fences and you're going for the ultra, either it's trillion-dollar company or bust, okay, maybe that is something you should emulate for those folks. But it's hard to know. So the question I like to ask everybody at the end of the conversations, Anna, is if there's one single piece of advice that you would give to every entrepreneur to sort of strive for or achieve excellence, what would that be? And I know it's very hard to boil it all down into one thing, but if there's one thing that you would tell people, what is that? What is that thing?
Listen,
Yeah.
listen to those around you and don't be afraid to act. I think that, being an entrepreneur and founder is incredibly hard and there's so much pressure. But I think sometimes you just get so busy that you don't stop and really listen to what's going on in your organization and around you. And I think just taking that minute to listen and act on what you're hearing on that feedback and being humble enough to do that, I think it's an incredible quality to have as an entrepreneur.
Does the predicate to that or the requirement with listening is also asking the right questions? Or is it just, hey, someone's just open your ears. Someone wants to talk with you, just say, I'm here. I mean, what do you need to ask questions to do that? Or is it just, just be open-minded?
I think just listening. I think that one of the most valuable things I've learned in my career is that sometimes we need to talk less and listen more. And people will reveal a lot if you just sit there and listen and hold the space for them.
I completely agree. It's one of the things that I've tried to work really hard on in my career as well. Is listen. People talk a lot when you just let them talk. So speaking of listening, how can people find you, Anna? Where can they find you? How can they learn more if they want to get more advice or go deeper? Where can folks
Yeah,
find you online or in real world?
absolutely. So they can find me at lenhardtpartners.com, and they can also find me on LinkedIn under Anna Lenhardt. And I would love to stay in touch and hear from them.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it. I know I learned a ton. I have like all these messages. I'm going to go my flagship here. I'm going to go message my team right after this. So this was really valuable for me and hopefully for everyone listening. So thank you for the time. I appreciate it. Time is so precious. So thank you for providing me and the team with some right now.
Thanks so much.
Yep.